Well, hello, and nice to see you back on again. We're in pre-show mode. Let's put that on. Hope everybody's well this Tuesday evening, and very interesting conversations in the chat so far. Welcome to you all. Nice to see some old faithfuls and some new names too. Just me tonight, of course, going to be talking about my latest data and setting it in context which I think will be an interesting conversation. As normal, the doggies are here, looking a little bit more active than sometimes. There's Meteor. You might notice Meteor's new collar. Decided it was time to replace the old chewed one. The reason it gets chewed is because Luna grabs her by the collar and plays with her quite hard. So eventually the collar goes. There you go. That's the doggies. And of course, here's the studio for those who've not seen it before. It's all set up so I can operate it myself. And I have control panels on the desks here. I've got the various screens around me, including the multi-view and the chat and the various other content screens. And we manipulate it by a series of buttons. Hopefully the buttons work. So far, it's looking pretty good. So should be interesting and hopefully a very important conversation tonight. So much to talk about as well. So let me take the pre-show off. I'm going to start the show. We've hit 8 o'clock and I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening. Welcome to this live stream on the 11th of November, 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thank you for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. Really appreciate it. And this is an important conversation, particularly at the moment, given the disconnect between what the reporting we see in the mainstream media and what I'm seeing in my data with regard to household finances. So we're going to delve into that a little bit and set it in the context of some of the other issues that have popped up in recent times. Nice to see Jason just popped in there. Hi, Jason. Hope you're well. And Smooth popped in just before as well. So hi, Smooth. Nice to see you on as well. It's always good to see the old favorites coming back. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. It is really appreciated. Before I start, just remind you that I'm not providing specific financial or legal or property advice. This is a general conversation. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, and suggestions as we go. And if you would like to ask a question, if you use that Walk the World, that'll get it into my queue. And I won't necessarily be able to follow everything that's going on in the chat because there's just so much action there. But if you use that Walk the World, then it'll get into my queue. And also, I enable Super Chat, so you get your question to the top of the list. Or indeed, make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate those who support us via the Super Chat and also via the other methods, including PayPal and Patreon. It really does help to allow us to continue to do what we do. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we really think it's a really important conversation. And Robbie's in the chat. Historic day for it. Yes, we had a certain revolution 50 years ago. And other issues as well. Of course, the 11th of the 11th of the 11th is also important too. So yeah, hello, Robbie. Nice to see you in the chat there. I need to get you back on to talk about China because you've got some really interesting insights now having been there. So we must make a date to do that. Anyway, let's get on with the show this evening. And yes, I don't know. The short answer is it's looking as though you've got the ats now, not the normal names. It's the way that YouTube does it. I haven't changed anything. It's just the way that YouTube's doing it at the moment. Possibly they'll change it back. I don't know. But unfortunately, nothing I can do about it, I'm afraid. So we are stuck with what we've got. So I apologize for that. But YouTube does these things from time to time. You know, the fact of the matter is that it is just something which I can't control. And Robbie, look forward to it. Okay, I'll send you a message. Now, what I want to do this evening was to talk specifically about the question of households. And to remind you, the title is Can Households Balance Their Books? Insights into Family Finances. I think this is a really important conversation. And the reason why I think it's so important is because a lot of the reporting in the mainstream media is about property, and, you know, buy another investment property. Interest rates are dropping, you know, prices are booming, but it's missing sort of most of the critical issues for many people. And there's a big dissonance between what I think we should be talking about and what is being talked about. Now, I made a show the other day titled Can Households Balance Their Books? And that was a quick run through of the analysis that we're going to cover today. But it also allowed me to discuss something really important, which is the way I do my research is a little bit different. I start with a hypothesis, and I've got a very strong hypothesis about what's going on at the moment. And we will come to test that against some of the data rather than just drowning in data from all over the place, as many others do. Economists are actually probably the worst because they grab data from all over the place and then try and make sense when you've got data pointing in all different directions. Now, my approach is a more scientific approach where you actually start with a hypothesis, a thing you want to test, then you test it by using the data that's there. Very different approach. And that's why I spend a lot of time talking specifically about households and the way households work. Now, on the way in, I just wanted to share a few initial insights based on some of the recent news releases. And this is one of the ones that I thought was really interesting. This is from the UK. So it's just been announced that the financial literacy in the UK will become a compulsory subject for all primary and secondary schools in England, with changes set to be in place by 2028. Under the changes that aim to modernise the national curriculum, schools will be required to teach content on budgeting, compound interest, money management, and mortgages across both and secondary schools. And from September 2028, primary school pupils will be taught about the basics of money, as well as how to recognise fake news as part of media literacy teaching, and also about climate change too. Now, let's not go there. But the point is, this is going to be wrapped up into something called compulsory citizenship classes. But this idea of financial education is critical. In my surveys, about half of the people that I interact with through the surveys really have no idea where they are and don't understand just the basics of finance, which is really concerning because they're actually committing to significant debt and getting themselves quite often into significant pressure. So I think this is an important move. Now, my question is, why has it taken this long to get anywhere close to providing any education and the level of understanding? So even simple things like compounding interest and making comparisons between different interest rates is something which many people just find difficult. And when we start talking about budgeting, people's eyes glaze over as though it's some mysterious, crazy thing you'd never want to do. Well, actually, it's not that hard. And to me, it's really important. So we'll get into some of that. That's one of the reasons why I think we have so many finance questions. But as some people are saying here, financial education, too little, too late. Absolutely. Should have been done a long time ago. And as Smooth says, it's got to be done in a very basic fashion. And yeah, interesting one here. The problem is that the more informed you are about classical financial education, the worse you end up. The money printer is 10% a year. Debt isn't bad. Being short fiat is an issue. Well, I sort of half agree, but I actually think that the basics of money and understanding the value of money and those sorts of things, and things like compounding and budgeting, are important. And I do actually think that people don't understand how significant debt can be as a problem. And, students, when they go to university now, start incurring debt. All of the social media channels are pushing debt left, right, and centre, credit card debt, buy now, pay later, all sorts of other types of debt. Then you're encouraged to get a mortgage. And so the idea is that you will be indebted for life. Now, I have a problem with that. I've always believed that more debt isn't necessarily a good thing. There are times where getting debt is useful, like getting a mortgage. But nevertheless, it can become something which is a dragon around people's throats. And unfortunately, in my surveys, I see a lot of people really concerned about their finances. So there's a really important balance here. And I agree, you can talk about fiat being devalued, you can talk about all those things. But the fact of the matter is that debt is now institutionalized in many households. It's just assumed to be the natural course of events. And of course, 50-year mortgages and all of those things. I've had several people say to me, well, I'm going to be in debt until I die, but that's not for me to worry about. I'll let my estate, if I've got anything left, solve it. So I will go to the grave with debt. Well, that's one way of thinking about it. I would argue that's not necessarily a good way of thinking about it. Now, just a couple of little insights on the way in. This was quite interesting. The latest Westpac Melbourne Institute survey showed that consumer sentiment among homeowners has actually rising significantly. For mortgage holders, well, not so much, because of course they're rather disappointed given there are no rate cuts coming for a while. And renters are looking to buy, maybe are welcoming the high LVR support, but nevertheless, you can see there that consumer sentiment is not flash. But on the other hand, of course, if you look at the banks, this is CBA's latest results showing that home lending grew 6.1%, and that's September 25 versus June 25, up 9.3 billion or 1.1 times. The 6.1% was 25 versus 24 September. So that's 6.1% is a lot more than the annual inflation rate. And they did also make the point that the operating income was driven by strong lending and deposit growth, but headline net interest margin has been reduced. So they're finding a bit of pressure there. Operating expenses up 4%. So you can see there that they do have some pressures. And as a result of that, the net profit after tax unaudited was 2.6 billion. Still a nice return, way high returns from where I think it should be. But you can see here that they are absolutely relying on significant mortgage growth to bolster their profit and return. And this is, frankly, just part of the problem. So, as Jason says, 50-year mortgages make systems and mint over time. System is broken, banks are greedy, and division in between groups is increasing. I think that's exactly right. And as we will see, this 50-year mortgage thing is something we should definitely be concerned about, because, you know, the average first-time buyer is in their 30s now. So add 50 years, they're going to be in their 80s if they would get a 50-year mortgage. They'll never pay it off. So they will be in permanent paying interest on their mortgage, just as if they were renting. And actually, some people are saying, well, maybe what we're really seeing is the perpetuation of renting. You will own nothing, you know, all of that story. The other point, of course, the discretionary data showed, this is ABS discretionary spending. In my other show, I said it was the ATO. I got the wrong three-letter acronym. It's the ABS. And it's interesting that you can see here that it's non-discretionary spending was actually most of the growth, almost no discretionary spending, flat. And you can see also that goods spending rose 0.4%, beating a flat result for services. So people are having to spend more just to stand still. Now, another little bit of interesting news here, that credit card debt climbed by 530 million in September and almost $1 billion year on year, as Australians found it harder to stay on top of their debt payments. This is according to analysis by CanStar using the RBA credit statistics. Analysis of RBA credit figures shows that the total debt accruing interest on personal credit cards has reached $18.4 billion in original terms. That's the highest level of debt outstanding since July 2021. Of course, July 21 was just after the COVID period. And by the way, CanStar also went on to make the point that if someone is only paying the minimum on one of the biggest credit cards, then it's a debt trap, basically. It will cost you an incredible amount, average rate of 18.61%, and it would take 40 years to clear the debt. That's not including the annual fee or any extra purchases they might put on the card. So if you would pay a little more, then you would be able to get out of it more quickly. And, you know, I'm not somebody who doesn't use a credit card, but I am somebody who always pays off every month because I like the flexibility of credit cards, but I don't like the interest rates. And by the way, there are some people on 26 and 27% interest rates on their credit cards. There are some lower ones around, but you need to shop around. So this is a really important point about the debt noose. And certainly I see that in my surveys. And in my surveys, I look at mortgages and credit cards and buy now, pay later and personal loans and other types of store credit, all of those things, not just the mortgage. And that's something which, of course, a lot of the other surveys and things don't do. Another interesting observation, this was actually published in news.com.au, suggesting that when you've actually got the average $1,200 a month on lifestyle purchases, what you're then doing, like entertaining and shopping out and travel, that actually is $4,400 a year, which is actually a way towards a 5% deposit. So maybe, their argument here is if you actually were to cut back on your discretionary spending, well, you could perhaps save for a deposit. There is an important point. Discretionary spending is way down, partly because people are redirecting specifically to help with the, particularly to help with the payments, but also maybe to do with the fact that people are actually just struggling as well. So there's lots of different things under the hood here. And what I think so fascinating about all of this is that the story is often partly told, not fully told. And if I go back to that point about the minimum payments, you can actually see here in this chart that, it would take 40 years if you actually made the minimum, whereas actually if you paid a little bit more than that, it would be quicker. And I think this is really important. Bearing in mind, credit card debt is rising. And I see that in my surveys. So much is actually in the works here. When you start looking at individual households, which is what I do in my surveys. Other point it's worth highlighting, and that we touched briefly about the 50-year mortgage proposal. This was actually Aidan Devine in the Telegraph. Talk about Aidan in a second because he actually covered some of my data as well a little while ago. A radical plan to stretch home loans out to 50 years, which was floated by Donald Trump, would be savaged by an Australian has been savaged by a housing Australian expert. Guess who it is? Aaron Scott, co-founder of Be Right Agents, said any move to adopt ultra-long home loans in Australia would be a disaster for borrowers, which he's right. And, the argument that this actually makes property more affordable is a furphy. You're paying a lot more for a lot longer. And like I say, you ultimately become somebody who pays and pays and pays and pays. And of course, that bolsters the financial system. And that potentially puts more upside to property prices, because if people can borrow more, that means they can spend more, which lifts prices. And I've argued for some time that it's actually the availability of credit, as well as migration, that is actually pushing demand for property up. And that's why property prices are continuing to rise. And as we'll come on to later, the demand and supply side is a very different story for the one that a lot of people are actually thinking it is at the moment. So the truth is that the longer mortgages means companies will pay lower wages. Well, probably will. The other point, of course, in all of this is that the banks are winners, and that's what I find more and more difficult to sort of come back to. If you think of the analogy I sometimes use as the black hole and the event horizon, well, the financial system is effectively expanding and expanding, expanding. More of the economy is actually being sucked into the financial system. And what it means is that effectively ordinary Australians are having to pay more and more for longer and longer. And it's not actually very, very good. You do earn more for their shareholders, which divides the haves and the have-nots. But it's also worth noting a lot of Australian bank shareholders are not in Australia. So a lot of those dividend payments goes overseas. I know that there's some superannuation in Australia invested in the big banks, but a lot of it is actually overseas too. So effectively, it's a way of siphoning funds offshore and into investors overseas. So that's something else to bear in mind when you look at this. Now, just one other conversation point on the way in here. This was quite interesting. The RBA warns about the economy may be boxed in by low productivity. And this is Deputy Governor Andrew Hawser saying that the challenge was significant. This low productivity may mean that interest rates can't come down, and it means that effectively the economic recovery is probably going to be a lot lower. And of course, they can talk about productivity, but it's not really their mandate, is it? And I would remind you that there was this big meeting in Canberra a few months ago with the treasurer and a whole bunch of hangers-on talking about a bunch of things. Well, nothing's happened, right? So productivity is a big deal, and the RBA continues to call it out. So all up, maybe by 2035, we're going to see more and more people in the rental sector. That's been a trend that we've seen in recent years. A greater proportion of households are actually in the rental sector than ever before. And also a greater proportion of people have a mortgage than previously. The proportion who own outright is continuing to drop. And so we are seeing this pressure on households to try and actually find somewhere to live. And that's creating significant pressure. Oh, and by the way, the vacancy rates in Australia, according to SQM's latest, is still pretty low. The vacancy rate in October 2025 at 1.2%, 1.2% in September as well. And you can see there that it is lowest in Perth and in Darwin and Hobart, and it's highest in Melbourne. Now, as I mentioned before, I got some nice coverage from Aidan Devine, who was looking at the surveys and the results that we did. And the story here is that there are pressure points in various areas. I use the stress analysis, and we'll dive in that in a bit deeper. But the fact is that this is actually important to get coverage. I had somebody ask me the other day, why isn't this on the front page? Why isn't this something which is actually being spoken about regularly? Well, the truth is, and thank you for the super chat, really appreciate it. The truth is that this is sort of not news because it's a continuous process that I've been monitoring for a good number of years. And, occasionally a journalist will grab it and run with it. But it's sort of not the latest and greatest piece of news. And so what I find is that when I speak to journalists about this, and I do quite often speak to them about this, what they say is, well, it's just status quo. This has been the same for a long time. So is it really news? Well, I think it is. And I think it should be spoken about a lot more. And one of the reasons why I do these shows is to try and share some of the information to the story there. Robbie's asked the question, interesting question. Can you tell how much Victoria's investor tax has contributed to the high vacancy rate? It has. So I'm seeing a significant proportion of property investors trying to get out in Victoria. And when you look at it, the debt investment returns are very low. So that's effectively the cost of the property versus the rentals you can get. And the costs include, of course, the extra taxes, as well as the various things that were required on investors in Victoria relating to, for example, smoke alarms and other bits and pieces to make the house more habitable. So there's a reason why property investment in Victoria is souring and why investment, therefore, the vacancy rates are slightly higher than elsewhere. People are running from Victoria because of what's been happening there in recent times. And Jason, talking back about productivity, low productivity, I'd be interested to see productivity figures for the indebted Victorians when businesses flee the state. It's not worth operating. Indeed, and businesses are also leaving. I see that in my SME survey. Again, people are actually finding that Victoria is not a good place to do business. It's not a good place to live. And so the number of people trying to run away rather than come to is actually now quite asymmetric. So as I continue to talk about this, and Aussie Jean says, as I see that, yep, credit cards are good as long as you pay them off every month. Insane. Yeah, they're a reasonably good, and you earn some points and things. But of course, unfortunately, a good half of people who use credit cards have revolving debt on their credit cards. And quite a few of the people in my surveys have significant debts. We're talking thousands and thousands of dollars, not just on one card, but on multiple credit cards. And they've got no hope of trying to actually get by. They just sort of, move money around and get another card over here and then move money across. But they're actually just building a bigger pool of debt. And that debt is often at 20% or more in interest rate. Oh dear. And Cookie Boy said, haven't you heard Melbourne prices are rising? Well, maybe. I'll look at that shortly. And Aussie Jean said, not just the taxes in Australia, machete violence, now possible land title issues too. Yeah, there's a lot of issues going on. And it is interesting when I look at some of the crime statistics. there's a strong correlation between high crime rates and high levels of mortgage stress or rental stress that I see in my survey. So all these things are somewhat connected. Now, when we actually think about what's going on, there's a couple other interesting observations. This came from Lucy Dean, highlighting the fact that some people are actually concerned, particularly young buyers, about entering mortgage prison. Even with the 5% deposit, the worry is the size of the debt, which is probably exactly right for some people. A lot of people, when they do the cash flow analysis, says, "Oh, I still can't afford it." So it is, very concerning. And as Cookie says, the non-stop spruiking is ridiculous. Look at regional prices and ask about selling prices. They're still falling. Spruiking. And, the fact of the matter is that people are actually being caught on one hand with, you got to buy. But when they come to do the analysis and look at affordability, you often find that they actually then say, "Oh, I can't afford it." And despite the fact that the banks have actually opened the aperture a little to ignore, for example, HEX debt, so that means that you can you get a little bit more now. And of course, with a 5% deposit, in theory, you can actually then go with a small deposit. But that means you've got a 95% loan. That means that your mortgage will be bigger. And that means that the interest rate potentially will be higher. It's almost a subprime loan in some people's regard, but it means that the interest rate might be higher. So the actual amount you have to pay on a month-by-month basis will be quite significant. And of course, the original prospect of continued rate cuts, which is what people were thinking about earlier on, is proving not to be the case. Now the RBA is saying we're probably sideways, maybe one more cut, but then probably we're at the end of the cutting cycle, and the next move could be up, inflation being too high. Now, with all that said, of course, people are still talking about the clearance rates being up, and the shrinking prospect of further interest rate relief failed to dampen the spirit of buyers who pushed the auction clearance rate nearly 72%. Well, I'm not sure about that. Certainly, there is the rates pause, but when I look at the domain results, they were at 68% in Sydney and Melbourne, and nationally at 66% this year, which was down a bit. And remember, this is a false calculation because it's looking at the number actually reported versus the number sold rather than the number listed. Of course, that means that the true clearance rates is a lot lower, as I always say. And just going back to the RBA, just to highlight this once again, because I think it's so important, they are saying they believe that prices will rise further because of the government's 5% deposit scheme. And the RBA also in their modelling highlighted the fact that, in fact, rising house prices contributed positively to GDP. So the RBA, you could say, is the fact of the matter. They want prices to go higher because it will support GDP. But of course, that's what Treasury is thinking. I would argue that that is really a very very bad way of thinking about it, not least because it's putting more and more pressure on households, and that's what I want to get on to now. So going back to my question that I posed the other day in my show there, have we reached peak housing stupidity yet? Well, maybe and maybe not, but it's certainly off the scale. And quite a few people who commented on that earlier post said, no, you got to understand that there's actually a lot more to go. Now, as I get into my analysis now of the stress information, I just want to highlight again, I use what I call deductive reasoning. So this is basically, we start with a hypothesis. My hypothesis I'll show in a second. And then we do some testing, looking at the data to see whether it actually works. And here is my hypothesis, for those who have not seen it before. In Australia, there is a rising proportion of households who are experiencing significant cash flow pressures because of rising housing costs, higher goods and services costs compared with income, and as a result of that, they're having to make difficult trade-offs when spending. So we would expect to see higher mortgage and rental stress, a greater use of food banks, and more calls to debt helplines. And as I showed the other day, Food Bank reported that there's been a significant increase in access to food banks in recent times, making the point also that families and friends are dropping support. So food relief from charities has become more crucial, and that's being reported pretty much across the country, even in Perth. And also the calls to the National Debt Helpline are up 12% on 2023. Now, somebody says to me, well, is that simply because people are more aware of the National Debt Helpline? Well, they've been advertising forever. And when I talk to the debt counsellors, as I often do, they are actually saying, no, we are seeing more significant use of those helplines, but by households who generally would not need help. So the breadth of the types of people that are actually now picking up the phone or using the chat facility at the National Debt Helpline is broadened. So more people are having difficulty. And as I showed the other day, there is actually some charts that show the trends are actually continuing to rise, and they are quite high. This is for calendar year, but of course it's 2025 isn't complete yet, so it's only 10 months data. And the story on spending, as I mentioned, was that spending is down, particularly on non-discretionary items, and all up, this is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of households. As a result of that, the question is, can people get by? Can people find a way out of this? Or is it actually going to be a problematic thing? And let me highlight again, this is not just interest rates. This is actually also things like the rate hike for unit owners. This is actually council's proposal increasing the burden on thousands of apartment dwellers by a significant amount. That's the Hills Shire Council will on Tuesday debate a proposal to charge apartment owners an extra $183 a year on average in rates amid a rise in high-rise apartment complexes across the northwest of the city. So when I look at my surveys, I capture things like rate hikes from the councils, as well as maintenance costs, strata fees, all of those things, as well as the other costs relating to mortgage. And so when you come to look at it, it is interesting to note that the unemployment rate, according to Roy Morgan, is at 20.7%, a lot higher than the ABS rate, and the unemployment rate at 10.3% compared to the 4.5% for the unemployment rate from the ABS. So you can see there that there is a significant set of pressures out there. And like I say, in my surveys, what I'm trying to do is to understand what's going on. Here is the model. I survey households on an ongoing basis, and there's unfortunately a lot of information now coming from my surveys. I've been running this since 2001. We slice and dice the data lots of different ways, and we can make some projections about where things are going using our scenarios, which we'll come on to shortly. So we can take all this information from the stress, the price, buying and selling intentions, migration, the CPI, economic data, through the core market model, and then we actually model the outcome and can even form a view of where property prices might be heading as well. Now, quick advert here, and I apologize, but I always want to make sure that people understand you can actually engage me for a one-to-one conversation if you'd like. This is a conversation, not financial advice, but looking at my data. And looking at my data, we can look at the stress and the home price trend data and form a view of where things might be heading based on my modeling. And typically takes about an hour via Zoom or phone. There is a cost involved because there's a lot of work to do to be able to put it together. And I'm booking 3 to 5 weeks out. If you'd like to book a slot, then you can contact me via the DFA blog. The links are below. Now let's get into the details. Just briefly, I'm going to reprise what I said in my earlier show for those who didn't see it. Won't go into quite as much detail as the other day. If you want more detail, go back and check out the earlier show. But just on stress, I have a very clear definition. It's cash flow, money in, money out. It's not 30% of income or taxable income. It's not underwriting metrics. Others are used in other contexts. By the way, 30% of income was used in the days when most people would be well under 30% of income. Of course, these days it's close to 40% quite often. But we define stress in cash flow terms, money in, money out. And it means that if households have more outgoings, I knock off one-off discretionary items. You might go on holiday once a year. That's not sufficient to put people into stress, but it's an ongoing basis. We define them as stress. If they've got a mortgage, they're mortgage stress. If they've got rent, they're rental stress. I can look at it from investors as well, and then put it together and look at all of the total financial stress across all households. And we look at it both in percentage terms and the count terms. And this model from the RBA, which I come back to because I think it's really helpful, you start looking here at budget pressures at the mild end. Over time, sometimes people move into missing payments and then ultimately could move to insolvency. But this traverses several years. A lot of people are in this budget pressure area. Sometimes they go back eventually, but often they sort of circulate here in budget pressure land for quite some period of time and ultimately wander up this way. I'd also make the point that banks, of course, at the moment are extending and pretending still. In other words, what they're doing is they're actually helping people extend the mortgage, go interest only, and reduce payments so that they can say that everything's fine. Unfortunately, quite often it doesn't end up being fine in the long run, although the banks are actually able to continue to take interest for a number of years. So that's one of the reasons why they do it. Now, when you actually look at the data, this is the summary data to the end of October, and you can see your rental stress is up at 75.1. It's still very high. That's 3/4 of those in the rental sector have cash flow pressures. Mortgages, half. 50% of people with mortgages have cash flow pressures and are having to make hard decisions and trade-offs and dipping into credit cards or putting more onto buy now, pay later, or if they've got savings, raiding the savings. The other 50% doing quite well, actually, and in some cases paying down mortgages. So it's very much a have or have not, an us and them. And Jason, of course, mentioned that earlier on. And the fact of the matter is, the story, of course, is that there are some doing well, but a lot doing not well. Unfortunately, I'd make the point, a lot of the people who are doing well, including the politicians, they're doing fine. Finance, big business, they're all actually doing fine. If you look down in small business land, if you look in ordinary Australia land, there's a very different story going on. So this is an important point, that the truth is that we've got this bifurcation, this K-shape going on, with some doing quite well and some not doing well. And again, this is not well reported in the media. And then, of course, the media spruiks the property price story and, buy, despite the fact that the price is not going up in areas we'll see shortly. And just to complete that little piece of analysis here, we also look at the RBA data. This is showing the loan or debt to income ratio, 181.4, but it's misleading because that includes all households where they've got a mortgage, whether they're renting or whether they own outright, includes small business too. So it's a false calculation. It's still higher than it used to be. But if you look at new loans, there are often 6 to 7 to 8 times debt to income ratio, which is very high. And it's putting a lot of people under pressure. Now, what I did the other day was then to go through the data, and I showed that, in fact, with the 50% of people in mortgage stress, that's more than 1.8 million. You can see there in yellow where they went up from last month. Rental stress at 2.3 million at 75%. Investor stress at 516,000 and 17.3%. And overall financial stress at 47.3%, which is 4.7 million households of the 10 million across Australia at the moment. And you can see I've broken it down there by state and by different categories if you want to dive into that in more detail. And then I showed the different cohorts, first-time buyers, young growing families, 91.5% in mortgage stress, the multicultural establishment, the first-generation Australians, people coming into Australia, finding that they have actually got rental stress almost immediately, 86%. So that means that 200,000 of recent migrants have significant pressures. And then we've got the investors definitely being involved with more affluent households, like executive professionals, young affluents. They've got a higher proportion of investment properties. Some have got 6, 10, 20 properties. Some of them are not doing well. Others have issues, but not quite so much. And overall, you can see here that the financial stress is highest amongst younger growing families at 68%. But it is worth noting that the largest cohorts of households, the disadvantaged fringe, have 490,000 in mortgage stress. And the suburban mainstream at 1.7 million, 380,000 are in rental stress. So it is broadly spread across the country. Now, the other day, of course, I then went on to go through the various mortgage stress. I'll put that briefly for people who want to pause and look at it. Liverpool's the top one there. We covered also risk of default with Cranbourne in Victoria, the postcode with the highest risk of default at 5.5%, with more than 1,200 households risking default over the next year. We then looked at the rental stress. Melbourne, the centre of Melbourne, the highest at 86.6% of people are there in the rental sector in rental stress. And then regional Queensland, Toowoomba, 4350. And it goes down the list there. You can see it. And you can also see there that investors are also in difficulty. Cranbourne in Victoria, 3977, top of the list there. Interestingly, at Narrabeen, for example, New South Wales, including Crow's Nest and Greenwich, places like that, half of investors are having difficulty. So it's quite significant. And then overall financial stress is actually very significant, with the postcode 2170 in Liverpool right at the top of the list, then Toowoomba in Queensland, then Campbelltown in New South Wales, and then a whole series of Victorian postcodes. This is the high growth corridors: Hoppers Crossing, Derrimont, Point Cook, Cannons Creek, and then of course the centre of Melbourne. And then regional areas like Ballarat, Mount Druitt in New South Wales, Southport up in Queensland around Labrador, and also Blacktown in New South Wales. So there's some of the hotspots. And the overall financial stress is very significant. So these are people who have cash flow pressures and effectively are not earning enough or have enough income coming in, including government benefits and other types of benefits too, to cover all of their outgoing costs. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of where we are. And the fact of the matter is, of course, that it's these households who have significant pressures. Now, this translates very interestingly to some significant property price dynamics, because what we often find is that some of the most stressed postcodes do have quite a few properties listed, and some of those property prices are actually somewhat lower than you might expect because of the number of people effectively thinking now of getting out. At the moment, because prices are still risen quite significantly, there are a lot of people who are actually thinking, well, maybe I should sell now, get out, pay the mortgage out, and then do something different. Of course, to do something different is the problem. Do you go into the rental sector where it's very expensive? Do you go back to family or friends? It's not easy. But my belief is that we are going to see households continue to struggle. There is nothing on the horizon that suggests to me that real incomes are going to be growing fast enough to cover the problems we've got. We've got very significant mortgages. The average mortgage is still a lot bigger than it used to be. The new mortgages are still 6 to 8 times income for many households. And so what we're seeing is that we've got households who, through home and land packages, go and sit in that property, and then they discover after 2 or 3 years, they start to have difficulties. Of course, they also, if they're living in these outer suburban areas, have significant tolls, because to get around you have to pay tolls. You've got significant travel costs more broadly because you need 2 or 3 cars often if you've got a family. And the infrastructure locally is not very good too. So there's a whole set of compounding issues together, which creates more and more financial pressure on individual households. So the truth is that this is a story which is continuing to go in a rather uncomfortable direction. And then, of course, the question is, what happens ahead? Well, I don't know. I'm not a predictor of what's going to happen, but I run scenarios. And just to remind you, my scenarios are ways of exploring different futures. They're not forecasts, but it shows you what the sensitivities may be. And for those who've not seen it before, we have 3 scenarios. The best case scenario, which is now to say that there will be a rate cut in December to 3.35%. It's unlikely, I think. We'd see inflation easing. The RBA is now saying inflation will be back in band in the middle of 2026, 27. Wages will rise faster than inflation. We don't get a recession, but we have very strong migration. So that's one. And by the way, I've now incorporated also the first-time buyer boom, more first-time buyers buying. My base case, a soft landing, is that rates stay at 3.6% until 2026. And actually, it stays above target. Until 26, we don't get a recession, but we see easing migration. And the worst case is a nightmare scenario. We've got sticky rates at 3.6% into 2026. Inflation steps up, but now we see unemployment rising. Wages growth stalls further, and that's partly due to the trade-led recession in Australia that we perhaps will see there. We see rate cuts later, but migration is dropping in the meantime. And so whilst rates come down a bit, migration stalls, and that then puts down pressure. And if we look at that, this is the average across the country. You can see there that in the best case, there's still an upside potential of 15% over 3 years for houses. The base case is going sideways. The worst case is down 20%. Units follow on. This is an average across the whole Australia. I can then look at individual places like Western Australia, for example, still very strong, 19% best case scenario over 3 years. Even in the base case, up 4.5% over 3 years. And the worst case, a fall, but not such a significant fall. Units would follow on, of course, in that scenario. If you go to Victoria, a significant story, 10% higher, maybe best case over 3 years. The base case, a fall of 5%, a worst case, down 25%. And you can see there that there's a big diversity again, and units would follow on. And we can look at another couple as well. We look at Tasmania, for example, bit of an upkick, 7.6% over 3 years, so not as strong. Base case, down 7.7%. 28% down the worst case. And you can see there that units would follow on somewhat similarly. If we looked at South Australia, significant rise, 21.9% over 3 years, best case, which is pretty horrendous, really. Too much, I think, too strong. 6.6% base case, 13.7% over 3 years, the worst case. And units, again, following on. Units don't tend to be quite so sensitive on the upside or the downside. And if we look at Queensland, 19% up, best case, 3.7% base case, down 16% worst case. And you can see here that how units would tend to follow on as well. And then New South Wales, 13.3% best case, 1.9% base case, down 22.3% worst case. Units would tend to follow on somewhat similarly. And finally, the ACT, which you can see up 7.6%, not as strong in the ACT, down 7.6% in the base case, down 27.9%. Units somewhat similar as well. And finally, the Northern Territories, well, guess what? Northern Territories up 20%. You can see here that the base case is up 5% for houses, down 14.9%, and units pretty close as well. So that's some of the sensitivity. So the point I want to make with these sensitivities, it shows you that the economic drivers, migration, interest rates, all of those things, unemployment, are significant. If the productivity remains low, unemployment will remain higher. By the way, in the UK, the unemployment rate hit 5% for the first time since COVID. Over the last 24 hours, it was just announced. So it shows you that around the world, there's also this question of higher unemployment. Underemployment is a lot higher, as I showed through Roy Morgan, than the unemployment rate, official statistics. So there's a big question about the unemployment numbers, of course, and whether they're relevant and appropriate. The fact is the surveys are broken, I think. So that gives you a context. Now, what we can do then is we can go and have a dive into individual postcodes. And of course, I go back to my postcode. I always look at Wollongong 2500 because this is actually one of my archetypal postcodes I come back to. You can see here the latest data. I have this data for more than 2,000 postcodes. This is the basically the core market model result for each postcode. And you can see here we have things like the household count, how many own outright, how many are renting, how many are borrowing. We have the latest mortgage stress data. We have the mix of property. Is it units? Is it houses? Is it other types of property? We know the people ratio. So, is it individuals, families? Vacancy rates also there as well. We've got the gross investment yield. That's quite important. Gross investment yield is the combination theoretically of the price if you were to sell the property today versus the rental you might get if you were to let it. Theoretical. The net investment yield is actually the real return comparing the income you get from the rent and the outgoings from the mortgage servicing, from the servicing of the property through, for example, the management fees and other bits and pieces all going into it. So in this case, negative. And then we've got the stress levels, you can see there, and also the scenarios in terms of where prices might run ahead. And in this one, well, there's still a best case scenario of 11%, base case down 4%, worst case down 24% in this particular postcode. And with that introduction, what we can now start to do is we can start to look at some of the postcodes that we've actually got. And I've got a few that I've loaded beforehand, which I'm going to look at first. I see there are a few people asking for postcodes, which I'll come back to. So hold off your requests. There will be time to cover them. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back over here and going to show you the first couple of comments I want to feature. This was actually one from Sue. Mainstream media not discussing what's really going on. Exactly, as I said earlier on, there's a real issue here. And the mainstream doesn't want to discuss it because it's not new news. Well, it's not new news because it's been going on for a long time. Now, I did suggest people could throw me comments beforehand with postcodes in, and people did that. So B. Finch asked for postcode 2068, and 2068 is Castle Crag in New South Wales. So if I then put that one in the model and move that across to there and go to there, this is 2068. So this is Castle Crag in Sydney. You can see here that we've got 6,400 households here. 6,400 households, of which 39% own outright, 36% of borrowing, 24% of renting. We've got just 19% in mortgage stress, but rental stress is pretty high at 77% and overall financial stress, 45%. We've got, interesting, I've got an NA there. I haven't got data for the LGA, which don't know why that's there. That's an error, sorry about that. 68% of houses, 20% of units, and 10% of the types of property. People ratio is quite high. This is families here. Vacancy rate at 6.9% is relatively low. The gross investment yield, 3.5%. Net investment yield is minus 1.2%. And you can see here that the average taxable income is pretty good, 184,000 from the ATO in 22-23, 168,000 from the census, gives a disposal monthly of $9,100. But here's the killer, 51.1% going on the typical mortgage, 4,680 a month, and 34.8%, 3,189 going on the typical rent. So it's pretty high. Now, for those who actually asked beforehand, I was able to not only look at the stress data in my model, but I'm also able to look at the price trend data, and it's quite interesting. So let's cut back to that. This is the price trend data for Castle Craig. It's very interesting. So in 2016, the average house was $2.85 million. And you see that it went up in 2017, down in 2018, up in 2019, 2020. Massive rise, nearly 40% in 2021, fell in 2022, rose in 2023. It's gone nothing in 24 and 25, and is now at 4.639. So it is interesting that in the last 3 years, there really hasn't been much going on, and 23, 24, 25. And that may surprise some people, but it is interesting to note that here in this particular one, then it's very flat. Now let's look at another one. Paul asked, do you do rural? Now I answered that by saying it's a survey. My survey is based on population density, so we tend to focus on those with more people at a postcode level. Some rural postcodes are very big and diverse, yet low population, so they may not be covered. So, throw in a postcode, I might be able to do it, but I might not. Depends on the data there. I focus on the big numbers. Next one from Bacon Sandwich, can I look at 2251? Yep, 2251, I can do that. And let's go back to my model. McMaster's Beach and places around there. Let's cut back to that so you can see it. Okay, and here's 13,000 households in this postcode, 41% outright, 41% of borrowing, 70.5% of renting, mortgage stress at 47%, rental stress is very high at 97%, 82% of houses in this area. The vacancy rate's a bit high, 12.6%, possibly because it's some second homes and Airbnb and those sorts of things. People ratio is 2.2, so that includes some families as well as individuals. Interestingly, the gross investment yield is 3.3, but the net investment is minus 1%. Taxable income, about 98,000, came with 89,000 in the household census, giving a disposal monthly of 5,678. That translates to 45.8% going on the typical mortgage, $2,600, and 39.5%, 2243 going on the typical rent. Price scenarios up 9.5%, best case over the next 3 years, base case down 5%, worst case down 26% for houses. Now, what we can then do is we can go back to the price movement data, and McMaster's Beach is another quite an interesting case study in terms of the prices, as you'll see here. So back in 2016, the average medium value price was $965,000. Went up in 2017, 2018. Sorry, went down in 2017, up 2018, up in 2019, up in 2020. Massive rise in 2021, close to 60%. Fall in 2022, up in 2023, down in 24, down in 25. And you can see there that over the last 23, 24, 25, it's going down. Price today, 1.72 million. And this is quite interesting because we are seeing this in a number of areas. This idea that everything is going up is just not true. The median price, it's falling in this particular area. Let's go to the next one from beforehand, and this was quite interesting. This was quite a long post. First generation migrant reaching my 20th year, rented mostly on the East Coast, and is talking about some stress, productivity is improving, confidence, financial security. Well, fair enough. Interestingly, they're talking about bank balances at zero, no insight in financial stress for many. I think that's exactly right. Tough times, and there are many investors and first home buyers chomping at the bit. Yes, exactly. Hungry real estate agents are twisting the arm of my home investment friends, literally bullying them into lifting the rent for tenants. That is very, very true. And you asked specifically about Cairns and Kennington. Well, let's do Cairns first. That's 4870. So let's go back to the model. Okay, so this is 4870, and you can see here 39,000 households with 33% borrowing, 41% are renting, 38% in mortgage stress, 40% in rental stress. Overall financial stress is 33, so it's not too high. House prices, houses 59% houses, 25% units. The people ratio is 2 and a bit. The vacancy rate's 10.7, so Airbnb and second homes up there as well. Gross investment yield is 4.1. Net investment yield is negative 0.5%. Average taxable, 83,000. Household census said 78,000. That gives you a disposable monthly around $5,000 on average. 34.3 going on the typical mortgage. 27.6 going on the typical rent. And you can see here that the scenarios still look like significant rises. Ahead, 21.7%. Best case over 3 years. Base case up 6.2%. Worst case down 14.2. Units tending to follow on. Okay, so that's that one. And just going back to my Cairns model, we can then look at the prices. What's the price trend doing? Here we are. So you can see here that there was a 423,000 in October 2016, massive drop in 2017, massive rise in 2018. Not a lot happened since then, really, until 2024. And so we're at $548,000 as the median price in postcode 4870. Now, you also asked about Kennington, which is a 3550. Let's go there. So this is in the district of Bendigo. 18,000 households there with 28% borrowing and 37% renting. Mortgage stress 45%, rental stress 45%. 84% houses, people ratio is just above 2, vacancy rate's 8.9, gross investment yield is 3.3, net investment yield is minus 1.4, and you can see here the average taxable 82 compared with 71,000 for the census. Gives a disposable monthly just over 5,000 with 31% going on the typical mortgage and 28% going on the typical rent. Price rises, best case 11% over 3 years, base case a fall of 3.9% and 24.5% the worst case. And then if we look at the story of price movements in this particular area, Kennington was 367,000 back in 2016. There were rises in 17, 18, 19 and 20. A massive rise, up 30% in 2021. 2022, a bit of a fall and a rise in 2025 to 640,000. 640,000 in 2025. Okay, one more. This is from Gover's 2652, looking to upsize to 2508 or 2515 markets. Valuations erratic, but there seems to be a change occurring. Let's have a look, shall we? Helensburgh and Thurrock. Areas I know very well, of course, because that's an area that I have very strong interest in. So let's look at let's look at Helensburgh first. 2508. Let's put that in. Lost my mouse pointer. 2508. Okay, Helensburgh. So this is including Coldcliff and a few other places, Oxford, but that's the postcode. So 3,000 households in the area, 52% are borrowing, high mortgage, 15% are renting, a lot of mortgage stress, you can see there. So financial stress is quite high, 85% of houses, and the people ratio is high, so these are families. Vacancy rate's 5.3, gross investment yield 3.2, net investment yield underwater, minus 1.2. Average taxable about $103,000. The household said $132,000. The multi-flag comes up because that suggests that multiple incomes are going to pay the mortgage, giving a disposal monthly around $9,900 a month, with 30.6% going on the typical mortgage and 26.6% going on the typical rental payment. Prices looking like significant rises, 70.4%, best case scenario over 3 years, base case up 2.4%, worst case down 17.7% over 3 years for houses. And if we go back and look at the price trends for this particular area, this is Helensburgh, of course, we're talking about here. You can see here that we had October 2016 at $764,000, significant rises in 2017, then falls the next couple of years, rises in 2020, massive rise in 2021, fall in 2022, rise in 23, rise in 24, rise in 25, giving now the median price at $1.291 million in Helensburgh. So you can see that there's been a little bit of an acceleration in recent years, but the massive spike in 2021 was really the significant event in this particular area. Now, going back to the model here, the other one was, of course, 2515, which includes Austinmere and Thurrool. And there, about 4,400 households, 41% own outright, but 39% are borrowing, 19.2% are renting, half are in rental stress, 38% are in mortgage stress. Mostly houses. People ratio is high, so again, families here. Vacancy rate includes some second homes and Airbnb, of course, in this area. Gross investment yield is 3.4, net investment yield minus 1.6%. Average taxable $121,000 compared with $125,000 from the census, giving a disposal monthly around $7,800, with 39.8% going on typical mortgage, $3,120, and 35% at $2,740 going on the typical rental payment. And if we look at the price trend in this particular area, and I've gone for Thurrool, well, seeing as Thurrool is an area that I know very well, of course, you can see here quite an interesting trend. In 2016, 998,000, a rise in 17, fall in 18, fall in 19, a rise in 20, significant rise in 2021, actually more than 40%. And then it's pretty much gone sideways there. It's now 1.832 million. And yes, I sold my property in this sort of area here. So, somebody asked me the other day, did I regret selling because prices are rising so strongly? No, they're not. Not in Thurrool. They're definitely not rising that fast at the moment. So that might negate some of the stories that people have with regards to what's going on in this particular area. Finally, another one here is 6026, and 6026 is including, it's a Western Australian one, of course. There you can see there, Woodvale. So let's put that one in the model, 6026. Okay, let's just bring that one up on screen, 6026. Okay, so here we've got 8,800 households, 41% owning outright, 47% borrowing, some renting. Mortgage stress at 57% for mortgage stress and 100% for rental stress. So financial stress is relatively high. 87% houses. Again, 2.53, so this is families here. Vacancy rate is just 4.2%. Gross investment yield is 4.4. Net investment yield is positive 0.2. I think that's probably the first positive net investment yield we've seen today. Multiple, 98,000. Average taxable, 111,000 on the household census. So multi-incomes going to pay the mortgage. Average disposable around 7,100 a month, with 35.5% going on typical mortgage and 30.9% going on the typical rent. Price rises, sure, 11.2% best case, fall 3.9% base case, worst case down 24.1%, and units following on. And going back to my earlier presentation, you can see here that the story on prices is pretty amazing. So in 2016, $573,000 was the median price. It's now 1.122 million. And you can see that since 2020, there have been rises at least 10%, well, around 10%, but above 20%, 24, and so far in 25. Well, it's pretty strong. So that is pretty interesting. And just one last commenter here. Chris said, you're doing your subscribers and clients a disservice by excluding Darwin from the graphs and data you provide. How many viewers here know the following? And he goes on to talk about that prices were close to Sydney's and then it fell and then it's up and it's not having to deliver results over the next 6 or 7 years. An investor would likely see capital gains while being neutrally or slightly positively geared on a cash basis with capital tax write-offs to come. So, yeah. Now, I will say about Darwin, of course, it's a very small market, so it's a small number of properties. It moves around quite a lot. But we can look at what's going on in Darwin. And I will just go to look at my data for Darwin first, which is, of course, is 0800. And we'll put that data up. So you can see here that there are 3,200 households here. 15% are borrowing, but 75.9% are renting. Not much sign of stress in the area, which is interesting. Mostly units in this area. High vacancy rates. That could be Airbnb, it could be second homes, or it could just be a lot of new stuff. I don't have enough data on gross investment yields to be able to put information in, unfortunately. Average taxable, 87,000 compared with the household of 111,000 with a multi-flag, giving a disposable month of about $8,600 with 24.6% and 25.9% going on the typical rent. And scenarios would suggest rises of 30%, best case, base case up 14%, worst case down 5.6%. So there you go. That's the Darwin story. Remember, I'm talking units here. Units up 26%, best case, base case down up 12.9%, worst case down 4.8%. And just going back to the price trend data, you can see here that Darwin houses, let's go back to there, is all over the place. 657,000 back in 2016, 646,000 now, and you can see a massive drop, significant rise in 2019, and then sideways, a couple of rises. So that's the story on houses. Units probably more relevant, given the fact that units, of course, is the big story. And it's interesting, again, back in 2016, 657,000, dropped significantly, back to 400,000, went up, and now is 646,000 median price. So anybody who bought here or before potentially lost money or is sitting on zero profit gain. If you bought more recently, particularly when the prices were lower in 2018, you might be doing okay. So the Darwin story is more complicated than many people think. And it's quite interesting that if you look at unit prices, 657,000 back in 2016, 646,000 now. They've gone sideways. So that's just a little bit of an object lesson about it depends on how long you look over and what you find. Cookie Boys said Darwin is flat too. Some suburbs doing okay. It's a retirement village. Yeah, to an extent that's probably true, but you can see there that it really is not necessarily the the booming story that you would think from the recent reporting of the in the property portals. Now, with that done, I've done all the ones that came in beforehand. I've got time now to do a few in the chat. So I'm just going to have a look at the chat now and see what I can find. And there's quite a few people have asked me for postcodes. I may not necessarily be able to do them all, but let's start with this one. So there was a request for postcode 3033. So let's go to 3033. It's always interesting. I never know what I'm going to see when I go there. 3033, it's Keller East. Let's put that one in. Okay, Keller East. So here you've got 5,800 households with 34% borrowing, 18% renting. You've got mortgage stress at 22%, rental stress at 76%. Overall financial stress isn't that high. You've got mostly houses, 80%. People ratios saying families. The vacancy rate 6%. Gross investment yield is 3.4, but net investment yield is minus 1.1. Unfortunately, a lot of places in Melbourne is underwater at the moment. Average taxable 97,000 compared with 99,000 from the census. Gives a disposal monthly around $6,600 with 38.8% on typical mortgage, 2,600. 30.2%, just over $2,000 going on typical rent. And scenarios, well, the best case scenario would be up 10%, base case down 5%, worst case down 25% for houses in this area over 3 years. So that's that one. Okay, let's have a look what else we've got. Let's see what I saw a few other requests, I think. Okay, oops, New Zealand 2077. Hornsby. And the Central Coast. Well, not quite the Central Coast. It's really, it's a bit lower down. It just depends where you draw the boundaries, I suppose. 17,000 households here. 24% owning outright, 37% borrowing, 38% are renting, 30% are in mortgage stress, 71% in rental stress, overall financial stress, 54%. Quite a lot of investor stress there as well, you can see there. 39% are houses, 55% are units. You've got vacancy rate of 6.6%, gross investment yield is 3.4, net investment yield is minus 0.7. Average taxable 96,000 compared with 109,000, giving a multi-flag, giving the disposal monthly of 6,662. 42.3% going on the typical mortgage at 2,820 and 34.4% at 2,292. And scenarios are best case scenario up 11%, base case down 4%, worst case down 24.7% for houses. Units 9.6%, down 3.35%, down 3.5% on the base case, and the worst case down 23.3%. And that's the story of Hornsby. Again, just looking down the story here, see what other ones we've got. I think I did that one, did I? 3033. Let's have a look. I haven't got a good enough memory. Keller East, yeah, done that one. So you already had that. Just going down now and seeing whether any others. If not, John Adams. Is that the John Adams? Welcome, John, if that's you. Hello, nice to see you in the chat. Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Really helps. And thank you for that. Cookie is going. Of course, he's up very early, so it's very nice. Nice to see you in the chat. Thanks for all the help with the slides, Cookie. More slides coming as well. Very good. Okay, well, I think we're pretty much done with the queries then. So as we come towards the end of the show, let me just make a few sort of closing remarks with regards to what we're seeing and what I think it means. Firstly, of course, when I come back to look at households' finances, I look at it in the round. I look at all the different incomes coming in, including government support. And most households have multiple income streams, of course, from various sorts. Some have investment streams as well. I capture all of those streams. And now look at the outgoing. So where's the money going? What categories of spend? Mortgage, rent, rates, strata fees, all of those things. And look at everything else too, to be able to put it together to understand whether people are actually above water or below water. Now, what I quite often find is that when I talk to people in the household surveys, a lot of people have really very little feel for where they really are from a cash flow perspective. And I'm surprised by that a little bit because I've just naturally done that. I've always kept records of, money coming in, money going out, and, where's it all going. But a lot of households don't. So it is important to try and keep a finger on the pulse. And so one of the things I often suggest to people, without giving financial advice, is that it'd be really good to be able to record what's going on. Use an app or put it in a spreadsheet. There are various apps out there. Somebody suggested the other day I might want to review some of the apps that are available. I might do that as a show. There are some good ones. There are some ones that, well, I think are a bit more dodgy. And some, of course, have in-market, in-app marketing where you buy stuff as well, which is not necessarily that good. So it is important to find a good way of doing it, but it's important to know where you are. So once you know where you are, then you need to categorize the different spending into different categories and understand what's essential versus what's non-essential, what's critical versus what's not critical. And there's some interesting debate, is a large mobile phone plan a critical expenditure, or is it nice to have? In many cases, what I find when I talk to the households is that they actually are spending money on things which they think is important, but not urgent, not critical, but nice to have. But that's still where a lot of money goes. So there's a question of prioritization. What I also then find is that quite often people aren't up to speed with, for example, what their mortgage repayments actually are, because rates are moving around, of course. And there are some people who are really focused on the rates and always getting the best rates and going back every few months and checking where they are. But other households almost set and forget. So they just assume that the mortgage rate's fine. If you've not checked your mortgage rate in the last year, go to a comparison site and check. You probably can do better. What is the rate on your credit card? If you've got interest on your credit card, you may well be paying more than you need. And as well as balance transfer opportunities, there may be cards out there with a lower rate. Again, a lot of people don't know. And even on the deposit side, there are a lot of people who do have some savings, but actually sitting in low interest bearing savings. And depending on how much you need that, maybe the time is there to move it to something with a higher interest rate. There are still some good term deposits out there, particularly now actually with the rate cuts off the agenda for the moment. So there's a few things that you can begin to do. But for those people who are in financial stress and sort of know that they've got a problem, once you start seeing it in front of you, it can be quite confronting, but it's also can be quite important to take the next step, which is to make those prioritization things and to be able to think about where to prioritize and what to prioritize. And cheers, Jason. Have a good evening. Thank you very much for dropping in this evening, and thanks always for the super chat. Really appreciate it. And so that's the point there. And then, of course, the next question is, what do you do about it? Well, you can talk to your bank. And if you've got a mortgage or if you've got other types of debt, they are sort of obliged to try and help. However, some of the solutions that they will offer, for example, restructuring a mortgage to extend the term or go interest only, doesn't necessarily solve the fundamental problem if it's a cash flow problem. It might give you a bit of wriggle room, but only if you change your behavior. And unfortunately, quite often what I find in my surveys is that people restructure, but then don't change their behavior. And so they still have this drain, this continued drain. And there's an expectation that magically incomes are going to start to rise relative to costs. And it's, if we just keep our heads above water for a bit longer, we'll be able to manage it. Unfortunately, with the trajectory of interest rates and costs now, it's clear to me that there are more and more households who are keeping their heads just above water, but really paddling really hard to be able to get there. So my perspective is that sometimes you have to be a bit more determinative than that and start to take more significant steps. So talk to your bank maybe, but I also think it's quite important if you've got a significant debt problem or a financial problem, to get some professional help. Now, I always recommend the National Debt Helpline, and the National Debt Helpline, of course, is on 1-800-007-007, and it's a free service. It's a government-backed service, and as I showed earlier on, they've got statistics which show that they've got significantly higher calls than previously. And this is a very, very important tool that's available for people. Got some really good experts there who can provide help. And they actually provided some statistics recently that showed that for those who actually do get involved with financial counsellors, 74% can avoid legal action, 69% are more positive about the future, 60% resolve their financial difficulties, 63% improve their mental well-being, 53% avoid bankruptcy, and 45% improve their physical health. My point is, these financial pressures are way more than just the money side of it. It has relationship pressures and health pressures. So it's important to get this stuff sorted out. So talk to those counsellors. There's another tool that I also recommend as well. The Statement of Financial Position on the AFCA website is actually very powerful. It's got information categories that you can put information in, And again, it's quite structured in the way that it does it. But that means you've then got information that you can provide to a financial firm or a debt counselor, or at least just helps you to understand where you are. So the truth is that this is a really good way forward to be able to go. And yeah, Jason, you're still there. Well done. And a good point you're making. Any solution offered by banks give them more money, sadly, not about helping people. They prefer to entrap them as they make more off the interest. Yeah. And I would say that extending the life of the mortgage, look at the 50-year mortgage, means you just pay a lot more interest over time. The banks make more profits. They can actually then also claim that you're not actually in default and in difficulty, so their debt levels, bad debt levels go down. Doesn't solve the fundamental problem. You've got to take ownership yourself as a household and begin to think about what levers you can pull. Now, what I also fortunately see sometimes is people grab credit cards, thinking, well, I can just put more on credit cards and get a couple more credit cards and keep going. Those interest rates are very high. Actually, the right strategy is often to pay down the high debt, high interest rates cards first to be able to reduce the amount of debt. But that's tough. It comes back to a bit of discipline and a little bit of focus. Now, and this is not easy stuff, right? And there are lots of people who find it really tough. That's why the financial counseling group can be quite helpful. But at least build a cash flow, prioritize, and talk about it. This is the other interesting observation. In my surveys, there is significant evidence that people don't talk about this enough in their household. They're worried about it, obviously, but sometimes talking about it, communicating on it is quite important too. So a few thoughts there in terms of what to do. Not financial advice, but just a general observation about what people can do. And the problem I see is that looking ahead, I don't expect interest rates to get cut particularly quickly. I suspect that income growth will slow in the months ahead. I expect that the cost of living will continue to rise because the inflationary beast is not tamed. And some of the stuff the governments are doing is actually going to continue to do that. Remember, they're talking about reducing the electricity support. Maybe it'll be extended, maybe it won't be, but that's going to cost more. Tax take, of course, is up, so people are paying more tax than ever before. And as a result of that, many households are actually in significant financial pressure. Another point there, when you actually look at the income in a household, I look after tax. A lot of the other people who are reporting are looking at gross, but the gross does not include the impact of the higher taxation that's now in the system compared with where it was. That's something that people quite often forget. Jason again, yes, you're quite right. Let's put that one up. Maxing out credit card when in trouble. Banks love that. 20% of greater interest. System is rigged. Credit providers make more in tough times, even with write-offs. They do. They do. Absolutely right. And that's right. Whoopee. 3 hours of power to do your washing, though. Well, it depends if you're on the right contract in the right state. Maybe. That's, of course, doesn't do anything about the fixed costs of energy. So fixed costs of energy will still go higher. So it's just going to spread them differently. So I'm very skeptical of that as a thing. But of course, it's an announceable. That's the final point I wanted to say. Listen to what the governments are saying. They keep saying, yeah, we understand. Cost of living. Look at what they're doing. Look at what they're actually doing. They're actually not wanting to tackle the critical issues. They actually want to stoke prices higher. They want to actually allow more people to get in with ever amounts of debt. They're actually helping the banks to increase their profits. They're helping the building firms, particularly the build-to-rent firms, to make more profit. And they're giving them tax breaks as well. So there's something fundamentally, radically wrong with the structure here. So it does actually then suggest that things are going to actually end up in quite uncomfortable territory. And if prices were to continue to rise at the rate that we've seen in recent times, what does that do to housing affordability? It just means that more people will be in the rental sector, greater demand for rent, and of course, contention then with the high migration. And in my earlier show, when I talked about the peak stupidity in housing, I covered migration. I covered the issues around that. I covered the need for the government to try and drive the GDP higher, which means if you put prices up, GDP rises, all of that stuff. So it's all part of the story. So there is a different perspective that we need. And what I've tried to do today in this show is to just show you the true story of what's going on. There are households doing fine. There are households paying debt down. There are households who are saying, whoopee, I can go and buy another 5 investment properties. But there are a lot of other people who are caught in this trap And this trap is not actually looking as though it's going to actually find a way out anytime soon, unless people take more responsibility for their own finances and take some of the hard decisions, which I guess is the bottom line message, really. It is down to individuals. Build a cash flow, reach out to the debt counselors if you need help, and get your finances under control. Check the interest rates on your credit card, check the interest rates on your mortgage, make sure that you're actually maximizing the amount of money that's coming in by spending it effectively, and of course also hopefully saving a little bit, because that's the other point. The number of people in Australia who are living hand to mouth, in other words, with no savings, is continuing to rise. A lot of those are in the rental sector, but a lot of those are also in the mortgage stress sector too. And being hand to mouth in the current environment is, I think, an extremely concerning situation, and that puts a lot of extra pressure on households and relationships, etc., etc. Right, last quick look at the chat in case anything is going on there. Okay, Bill asked, how much risk in the Australian market if a 2008 event happened? Well, the question is, if there was a 2008 event, what would happen? Markets would drop, presumably. Financial markets would drop. Banks would probably be less willing to lend. That means that credit supply would go down. That means that the availability of mortgages would go down. But we'd also have a lot of people potentially beginning to move into the default phase. But the default phase is a slow burn. If you think of the US, the peak defaults were in 2011, 2012, despite the fact that 2007, 2008 was the global financial crisis. Governments will bail people out. Governments will bail banks out again. But remember, of course, that banks now are also in a situation where the relationship between banks and deposits is different. There's this thing called the bailout. So you could well find that some deposits get grabbed and support the banks for a period of time, which means that your deposits in banks, which are sort of protected, could turn into shares in banks, which may not be protected. So that's another factor too. And given the overhang of debt that we've got, the fact is that if governments do decide to bail out again, that's going to put another huge upward swing on liquidity, could be inflationary ultimately, could put a swing also on more government debt, which means that taxes need to be even higher. And I would remind you, one of the reasons why taxes are higher at the moment across many countries, including Australia, is because of the massive handouts that were done through the COVID. Now, there was a need for some support through COVID, but I think they did too much. And you could argue that back in 2008, they did too much as well. There is a fundamental point here. You know, at the end of the day, commercial companies are there to make a profit, yes, but they're there to take risk. And if they take bad risk, then it should be the shareholders, not taxpayers, who actually feel the full downward force. But unfortunately, in this particular environment where we've got upside to the private, but downside and risk to the public. Privatize the profit, but share the risk around. And that's the problem we've got. So there's a structural and philosophical point here. This is a really important point to make. So if we were to have a big event, there'll be a problem. House price, of course, would drop as well, by the way. A lot of people could be in negative equity. And then, of course, the question becomes, if a lot of people are actually in negative equity, will the banks foreclose, or will they actually just try and get through? We'll see. So there you go. My high-level thoughts there. There you go. Yes, if a 2000 event happens, would prices drop? Probably would. Would the credit tie be? Yes, it would be tighter. And like I say, then begs the question, what happens to those properties? In the US, they demolished properties through the global financial crisis and beyond because nobody wanted them, despite the fact that they were actually priced a lot cheaper. So could be interesting. The final point to make is if we had a significant event in Australia, but not elsewhere, then that would actually turn down migration dramatically too. So that's something else to bear in mind. Anyway, I think we're pretty much there. We've come to the end of the show. I want to say thank you very much for spending time with me this evening. It really is appreciative of those who actually spend time on Tuesday evenings with us. There'll be another show next week. Leith Van Onselen's coming on. And we're going to talk hopefully about some of the economics and some of the things he's been doing recently, which is quite interesting. Just to say, if you're interested in information about the postcodes, those tables that I shared, you can actually get access to them via my Patreon service. And just to put that in perspective, I have various tiers at Patreon. If you would like to support me, really appreciative of those who do. Thank you very much for everybody who does support via Patreon. But there is a tier, the $50 per tier level, you can subscribe to, and you can get the 2,000 plus postcodes each month that you're subscribed. And that gives it basically the sort of information that I went through in the postcode analysis, not the price trend data, but the stress data and the count of households and those sorts of things. So that's the point to make there. And I also, of course, have a blog. And if you want to find out more about what we do, if you go to the DFA blog, you can see information there about what we do and how we do it. And all of the postings that we put up are there. Oh, and by the way, if you would consider supporting me on a one-off basis, you can do it via PayPal as well, which is another mechanism that we use. And again, I really appreciate those who support us. It makes a huge difference to us being able to produce what we do and to try and preach the gospel here about financial responsibility, about governments doing better on the whole housing question and the credit question, and trying to move away from the, frankly, noise that's there out in the mainstream from the property spruikers who are still talking about property prices rising. Buy, now. When there's a whole nother story here, as hopefully I've shown today, financial pressure on households is for some extreme and is likely to continue. So before I go, here are the dogs. They've been very quiet today, so that's nice to see. And hopefully time for a walk now. So that's my next plan. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Take care. Look forward to seeing you on the next show. Remember, I put recorded shows out each day, and my weekly live show on Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Sydney. It's Martin Hill from Digital Fanatics signing off. Take care. See you next time.